as you look at Chapter 4, the one thing that I would say to you as, even if you're employed now, as you look for a job or you look for a career, culture for you is something that I hope that you're starting to research in these companies that you're interviewing with and seeing, is this something that, that looks like something that would appeal to me. That looks like they share the same beliefs I do, or this looks like it's going to be a great place to work. This is what all companies strive for. And you want to see if it's going to be a fit for you. Culture, again, becomes what our reputation as an organization is going to be. So we say we want to do this from a service standpoint, A, B, C, D, E, and then we do it. That becomes our reputation. And as a manager, we are trying to train, reinforce all these different things about the culture of the organization. We're leaders, okay? And our employees are looking to us to reinforce this culture instead of it just being a poster that we walk by in the break room when we clock in, or something that we see in the back of the house that people basically make fun of. And you've probably done that at your jobs. You've seen a poster that says, oh, team means this, and you go, oh, you've got to be kidding me. We're failing on our culture if we're not managing this properly. So, again, a few key things to talk about, and the first one is going to be beliefs. And I apologize because it seems to be coughing a lot. The ideological core of the organization, relationships between causes and effects for the organizational members. Okay? So again, telling us how things operate, how the assumptions influence what we do inside the organization. So our core beliefs as an organization should be well presented to you and to the guest. Very important. The values are the preference for certain behaviors or certain outcomes over others. Right and wrong, preferred, not preferred, desirable behavior and undesirable behavior. Okay? That makes sense. We need to tell our employees what our values are. If it is providing good service and it's very important to us, then it should be made very clear to the organization, to the employees, how important that is, reinforcing our core values. Norms are standards of behavior that define how people are expected to act while part of the organization. So, from an advertising standpoint, we're trying to sell a service to you. You being the guest. Well, the guests aren't the only people that see that. The employees see that. So now they know, based on a commercial, based on an ad, what the expectation is for the guest, and that becomes a little bit easier for them to understand what is expected of them as far as delivering service is concerned. It's right there in the commercial. It's right there in the ad. We know how we're supposed to act. Folkways are things like shaking hands, addressing people by first or last name, wearing ties. That's going to be something that the organization decides. If you create your own business, it's something that you're going to decide, hey, you know what? I wore a tie for 15 years of my career and I never thought it was effective, so nobody wears ties in my organization. Great. Or it's very important that you say Mr. or Mrs. to all the guests, when you're giving back a credit card on a payment, or when you're making them closing out a tab at the bar, things like that. And that is, again, expectations that you set. So, you can say, I don't want you to do this, but I want you to do that. Again, that will be part of what you decide. From the environmental standpoint, formal learning in the culture is training and policies. Informal becomes the social interaction between you and the guest. So from a manager's standpoint, it is, if I train you to do something, that's responsible for you to understand how that affects your job on a daily basis and how it affects the culture of this organization. Okay, because that is translating it. Training is one thing, implementation is another. Subcultures within your organization. A lot of times in a hotel, for example, we could look at a department as a subculture, which, generally speaking, that's not a bad thing. But when it becomes housekeeping versus everybody else, or food and beverage versus everybody else, or front desk versus everybody else, we have a problem. The culture of consistency within the organization. We are one family, one unit. That's what we want. So if you get to the point where you're facing this pushback from a certain department in your hotel, for example, then you have a problem with that subculture. So it's very important. A lot of training that we have always done has been to move potential managers through all the departments of a hotel, for example, or all the different phases of a restaurant. So why don't you do that for other departments besides just managers? Employees within the departments cross-train and do these things to keep that culture going so it's not so divisive. Subcultures of nations would be if you move to a different area, not necessarily a different country, which it could be, but a different part of the United States. We had an organization that I worked for that moved to a completely different state, and we thought that our product would translate, and it was little nuanced things that didn't. Something as silly as types of beer that we served, or the way that we made sweet tea. Tiny things that just we had to go back and retrain, and how service was perceived in different parts of the country from one area to the next. Very interesting experiment for us that at first was not very successful. So how do we communicate our culture? Well, that's the key, and it becomes very, very important that we do that. So laws are very simple, rules and regulations. And, this is where we start to hear about policies and regulations, where we start to get into the Disney machine. So let's take an example, okay? If you are in costume in one part of Disney World, you can't walk to another part of Disney World. Okay? You stay completely in character, period. You don't take off any part of your costume, talk in your normal voice, or if it's a character that doesn't talk, you don't talk at all, and you don't interact with anybody while you're in costume. Of course, we all know, or I shouldn't say we all know, we're not employees, we're cast members. So that becomes part of this organizational language. Again, it's not for everybody. That's when I start saying about hey, do you work security for Disney? Yeah, I'm a security host. And, I just came from backstage. You may think that that's cheesy, but that is part of their culture, and that is something that they spend a long time letting folks know. Hey, you are a cast member. No one ever says they're an employee. That's how they treat it. That is training language. And they continuously reinforce that. So whether you like it or not, right or wrong, it's pretty clear from their language how the culture is perceived. And look, that's Disney, but there are tons of other examples of other organizations where they use specific terms for guests. And we've heard stories, and we won't get into it here, but you can always look it up. How does an organization deal with an unruly guest? Is there a specific term for that type of situation? How is it handled? When we look at transmitting the culture, we will always look at how we reward or recognize different people within it. And we take those examples of individuals within our organization and we give them a name, or we positively highlight what they've done. Stories as training tools are great because it helps us understand what's good. And let's just be honest, in a lot of situations, turning bad experiences into good experiences. And how that translates into, okay, based on this, we took a situation that could have been really bad and we made it positive by this. And now we have a new policy in effect where in that situation we have a new way of dealing with it. I always want to communicate this stuff, and we let we let that build the culture itself by just saying, can you believe what Karen did last week? Or can you believe the story about what Bob did for the customer who lost his whatever it's going to be? That's how that gets, and it becomes almost like a urban legend, but it's true. Symbols are physical objects that have significance beyond itself, can communicate unspoken messages. Mickey Mouse ears. The next time you go, if you don't ever want to go, I understand that too, but usually you'll find them hidden all over the park. So, and it becomes this fun thing where people try to look at it. Well, what does that have to do with cultural value? That's because it is such a part of their culture that that's how they subtly put it in everywhere. If you think it's overkill, I could hear your argument for that. Rituals, symbolic acts that people perform to gain and maintain membership or identity within an organization. It is how we go about recognizing and rewarding service excellence. Okay, employee parties. How we train for something to make it significant to everyone. There was a kind of a boot camp mentality to the very end of training that I did at one restaurant organization. I worked for a large corporation. And even though it wasn't boot camp, I am not comparing it to that by any stretch of the imagination, but everybody went through it. It was a rite of passage to get done with it. The ritual of orientation. We constantly evolve orientation at all levels because a lot of times it's all this stuff piled on at the beginning and you're like, oh my God, I can't go through any more of this, and you're not learning. When we teach culture to the employees, okay, it's a constant thing. Looking at values, norms, and laws, and it's management buys into it. Management constantly teaches it. The way that our employees learn is by us setting examples. And the reason that this culture is important is not because it's on a piece of paper. It's because I, as the manager, or you as the manager, or you as the owner operator, you see the importance of it. I'm doing it every day. That's why I'm asking. I wouldn't ask you to do something I'm not going to do. And here's the importance of why we do it and why it's effective and why the expectation is that our guests see it as well. And again, guests help us reinforce this by their values, beliefs, and norms. We want to have this thing that brings the two together, that meshes the two together. And there's a little caption in the book that talks about from Disneyland about ride operators learning different categories of customers and how they respond to parts they're playing on stage. And as cheesy as that sounds, it works. And you start to develop, we understand that, certain age child acts a certain way. And you can start to build these patterns and the expectation of guest service from the guest point of view. And it's teaching that culture to the employee to say, this isn't always the case, but the way that we think that this situation works is like this. Constant reinforcement of the culture. This isn't browbeating. This is to say, look, this is the effective way that the organization runs. This is why we have this culture, and this is why we think this culture works. Organizational charts and culture, leadership skills, changing culture. It's a constant evolution, if you will. When I talked about earlier millennials, new groups, whatever you want to say, instead of us getting, grumpy and pounding our fist on the table, and I never had to do that, it is the workforce is changing. And how do we adapt our culture to change with this workforce or with this new type of guest? Because if you don't, you'll fail. So you always have to constantly go back and look and see what, if anything, needs to change and how we can, get that into our leadership skills, how we incorporate that into the physical environment. So all important aspects and all something that should be examined on a very regular basis.